Hello again. Welcome back to the study of Following Jesus, Discipleship in the Gospel of Mark. In our study of this book, we have traced the unique message found in the Gospel of Mark, the message about discipleship, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We have followed the story of Jesus' first disciples, the original 12. We've seen how they have moved from being blind in the first half of the gospel to seeing but not clearly. In the first 8 chapters, the disciples were blind. That is, they did not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and they could not understand the things that he taught. But in the second half of the gospel, they are able to see, just not clearly. That is, they recognized that Jesus was the Messiah, but they still struggle to understand what he was teaching them. In fact, in the second section, they actually resist and reject what Jesus was teaching them. We've looked at the merit-based thinking that blocked the disciples' ability to understand what Jesus was teaching. That merit-based thinking is what Jesus called the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. This merit-based way of thinking and living emphasizes obeying laws and conforming to expectation. It focuses upon behavior and engages in rigid black and white thinking, the right and wrong thinking. This emphasis allows us to divide the world into us and them categories, those of us who keep the law and measure up and those who don't. We engage in comparing and competing with those others, in which we judge ourselves as better than and them less than, creating a hierarchy, a hierarchical society. And in that hierarchy, those who are better than use their power down against those who they consider less than. Out of this merit-based way of thinking and living, we create what I call the egocentric self, the egocentric identity. It is a constructed self, a false persona that we created based upon what the world said we needed to be and do if we wanted to be accepted and valued. In these last 2 sessions, session 4 and 5, we have focused upon the heart of the Gospel's teaching about discipleship, chapters 8, 9, and 10. There are 3 different teachings, one in each of those 3 chapters, about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. In these 3 chapters, Jesus was attempting to prepare his disciples for what he would experience when he got to Jerusalem, the suffering he would experience, his death and resurrection. But they could not understand what he was teaching them. And so out of their struggle to accept what he was teaching, Jesus then taught what it meant to be a disciple. Chapter 8, verse 34 is the first of those teachings. Jesus said, "If anyone would come after me, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." To take up one's cross was to live as an insurrectionist. It was to reject the thinking of the world and the way the world functions. It was to live in open defiance to the world's ways. We take up our cross in order to follow Jesus. To follow Jesus is to live in relationship with Jesus, learning a different way to think and a different way to live. For Jesus teaches the ways of God and the ways of the kingdom of God. And as we learn from Jesus, we move from thinking the way the world trained us to think, to thinking that is shaped by the character of God and the ways of God, what the Apostle Paul called the mind of Christ. We move from the world's way of thinking to thinking shaped by the character of God and the ways of God. And in that shifting, moving from to, we experience what Jesus said when he said, "Deny self." The merit-based thinking of the world created this egocentric persona, this constructed self. To deny self is to release who the world trained us to be. It is to turn our back on it. It is to surrender the persona that we constructed in order to gain acceptance and standing in the world. we turn loose of who the world created us to be. We deny self. As we learn the ways of God that Jesus taught, we learn to live out of a servant spirit. Chapter 9. Jesus said there is greatness in the kingdom as the followers of Christ. But that greatness is judged not by being better than someone else or not by achievements, but greatness is judged by a servant spirit. To be a servant of all. To be willing to serve even those who are, quote, beneath us, end quote, in our social standings. The servant spirit displaces the self-serving spirit of the egocentric identity. Our constructed self is always looking out for old number one, defending itself, protecting its veneer. But when we let go of the constructed self, the egocentric identity, then a servant spirit begins to replace that self-serving, what's in it for me spirit. And that servant spirit is expressed in how we use our power, the teachings in chapter 10. The way the followers of Jesus use power stands in contrast to the way the world uses power. The world uses power over, down against, for personal benefit at the other's expense. But the servant spirit uses power alongside of the other, for the benefit of the other, seeking the good and welfare of the other at personal expense. The very essence of discipleship is to reject the world's way of thinking and living, to embrace the ways of God that is expressed in a servant spirit that uses power to address the needs of others. Well, in this session, we move from the heart of the Gospel's teaching about discipleship into the next section of the Gospel, the last section of the Gospel. The last 6 chapters present to us the events that took place during the last week of Jesus' life, culminating in his death on Friday and his resurrection on Sunday morning. This is 1/3 of the Gospel. In this section of the Gospel, Jesus has two foci. The first continues to be the disciples. The disciples still struggle to understand what Jesus is teaching. They struggle to understand what he's trying to prepare them to experience. They still continue to think out of that merit-based world, operating out of an egocentric persona, egocentric identity that is based on comparing and competing and being better than others. Jesus is attempting to prepare them for the shock that they would experience when he is arrested and condemned to death and crucified. But he's also attempting to help them understand what they cannot understand. He's trying to give them a tool that will help them later understand what they are now rejecting. In doing so, he designs, orchestrates, and implements 3 acted out sermons. He follows the pattern found in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the prophets. When the people didn't want to hear what they were saying, they acted out their sermons. And that's what Jesus does. During this week, there are 3 acted out sermons. The first, Sunday morning, his entrance into Jerusalem. The second, Monday, in which he took control of the temple. The third was on that Thursday night or early Friday morning in their culture, in which he reinterpreted the Passover. 3 acted out sermons in an attempt to help his disciples understand what they could not understand and would not accept. These events would stick in their minds so that as they reflected on them after his death and resurrection, they would gain insight into what it means to live the ways of God. The second focus of this section of the Gospel is Jesus' interactions with the religious leaders of the nation. The opposition and resistance that began with the Pharisees in chapter 3 now comes to a head in these chapters. In taking control of the temple, Jesus raises the ire of the priestly families, the Sadducees, so that the Sadducees, the priestly families running the temple, join hands with their political enemies, the scribes and Pharisees associated with the synagogue. Together, they seek to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. And if they cannot discredit him by trapping him, they intend then to eliminate him, to get rid of him. Before this section of the gospel and the transition from the teachings about discipleship into this last week of Jesus' life, there is a story that is a transitional story. Throughout the gospel, the biblical writer has used transitions. From the first section of his gospel, he uses the parables of chapter 4 to transition to the section where the disciples are blind. He used the story of the man who was blind and needed a second touch to transition from the blindness of the disciples to them seeing, but not clearly. Now here, at the end of chapter 10, is a transitional story that moves us to the third section of the gospel. That transitional story is the story of the healing of a blind man known as Bartimaeus. The significance of that story is found in what the biblical writer says about Bartimaeus. Here again, from that story. Jesus said to Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately, Bartimaeus regained his sight and followed him on the way. The significance is that phrase, followed him on the way. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. Jesus was on his way to the cross. Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way to Jerusalem, on the way to the cross. The earliest Christians spoke of being the followers of Jesus as the people of the way. People who followed the ways of the kingdom, the ways of God. And to follow Jesus on the way was to follow Jesus on the way of discipleship. Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way of discipleship. I suggest to you that just like the blind man who required a second touch, Bartimaeus is a metaphor for the disciples. Bartimaeus shows us what the disciples will do once they see clearly. Seeing clearly, they too will follow Jesus on the way of discipleship that includes a cross, living as an insurrectionist against the ways of the world in order to live the ways of God. But before the disciples can see clearly, they need the second touch. And the second touch comes in the events that happened during this last week, particularly in the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Yes, the resurrection is a part of the second touch. It helps them to see what Jesus had been trying to teach them all along. But the death is also a part of the second touch. The pain that they would experience as they saw Jesus arrested, condemned to death, crucified, and died. That pain of their dreams being shattered, their hopes being dashed, their world crumbling, was an important part of the second touch. For it is that pain that helped them to release the egocentric identity. This last section of the gospel gives us the clearest outline of what took place on each day of that last week of Jesus' life. The first day of the week of Passover, Sunday, was the day that Jesus implemented the first of his acted out sermons. He planned, orchestrated, and set in motion his royal entry into Jerusalem in which he was presented to Jerusalem as the Messiah. The crowds who ushered him in sang messianic hymns, laying their cloaks and waving the branches were ways that they traditionally welcomed a king. And so Jesus planned this event in which he was ushered into Jerusalem as the Messiah. But he did so in a way to communicate that he came in peace as a servant. For he arranged to ride a donkey, a beast of burden. Whenever a king went out to visit his people, whenever he went in peace, he rode a donkey. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem riding a donkey, saying that he comes in peace to bring peace. He comes to serve. Jesus' entry was timed to be in contrast to another event that was taking place, another parade. As Jesus entered Jerusalem through the eastern gate, Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator for that region, entered Jerusalem through the western gate. He rode a stallion, a war horse, and he led a legion of Roman soldiers in full battle armor. They had come as reinforcements to the fortress of Antonia, that Roman garrison located adjacent to the Jewish temple. Their message was clear. Their military parade said that this is how Rome will deal with any who dare to defy them. They will use their military power to crush them to maintain Roman peace. Jesus was contrasting the peace that he brought, a peace through using power to serve, with the Roman peace in which power was used to crush anyone who dared to defy. Two parades, two kinds of peace, two kinds of king. After the parade, the scripture says that Jesus went to the temple, but it was late in the day, so he went out to Bethany to spend the evening. The next morning, Monday morning, he made his way back to the temple. On his way to the temple, the biblical writer records an interesting story about a fig tree. The story says that Jesus saw a fig tree in leaf and went to it to get a fig to eat. So here's the significance. Fig trees put on fruit before they put on leaves. So if they are leafed out, it is a way of indicating that they have fruit. But when Jesus got to the tree had no fruit, no figs. It had the appearance of being fruitful, and yet it had no fruit. It was fruitless. The story of this fig tree is a metaphor for the temple and for the nation of Israel. Both had the appearance of being the people of God, but neither bore the fruit of God, the fruit of the kingdom. Jesus went into the temple and took charge. He drove out the money changers. He drove out those who were selling sacrificial animals. And he said, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people," quoting from the prophet Isaiah. And then he quoted from Jeremiah, "But you have made it a den of thieves." Rather than being a place where people could connect with God, the temple had become a business center in which the priestly families exploited the desire of people to worship and used it to make money. Like the fig tree, they had the appearance of being fruitful, but they bore no fruit. Jesus cursed the fig tree, and Jesus took charge and cleansed the temple. That evening he returned back to Bethany. The next morning, which now would have been Tuesday morning, they made their way back to the temple yet again. And as they passed the tree, the disciples noticed that it had withered. Jesus had cursed it, and overnight it had died all the way down to the roots. And they made a comment about the tree being dead. And that's when Jesus taught that famous statement that if you had faith, you could say to this mountain, be thrown into the sea, and it would be. The faith to move mountains. From there they moved on into the temple where Jesus confronted the religious leaders, and he sat throughout the day teaching as different groups were sent by the religious leaders in an attempt to trap him. But no one could trap him. He answered all of their questions, and he challenged them to think. He challenged them to explore their understanding of the Messiah, to see a different way of understanding it, if that were possible. At the end of Tuesday, the biblical writer puts in a bridge to the last half of the week. That bridge is chapter 13, what is called the Temple Discourse, in which Jesus taught about the destruction of the temple that the disciples would experience. Then on Wednesday, Jesus was having a meal in which his head was anointed with oil in preparation for his death and resurrection. Judas agreed to betray him. Thursday, they prepare for the Passover, and Thursday evening, the beginning of their Passover on Friday, Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples. In doing so, he dropped a bombshell. He said, "Now one of you 12 will betray me into the hands of the religious leaders." And then he took that Passover meal and that Passover liturgy and changed it. He reinterpreted it, the third of his acted out parables. He interpreted the Passover meal as a reflection of his death, his suffering and death, his broken body, his shed blood. And what he was saying is that God will be at work in my death to bring you freedom, just as God was at work in the Passover to set the people of Israel free from Egyptian bondage. He was giving them a tool by which they could reflect upon his death after his resurrection in an attempt to understand what they could not understand. After the meal, he then said to them, "Not only will one of you betray me," Judas had already been excused, but he also said, "All of you will desert me." Peter, bold as ever, said, "These yahoos may desert you, but I'll die for you if I have to." And that's when Jesus said, "Oh, Peter, before this night is over, you will have to die that you even know who I am." Not once, but 3 times. From there, in that Thursday evening night, they went to Gethsemane. Jesus had focused on preparing his disciples for what they would experience as best he could. Now he prepared himself. He went to the Father in prayer. And he spent the night praying until Judas, leading a mob from the religious leaders, from the chief priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, came to arrest him. Judas identified Jesus in the dark with a kiss of greeting. And that's where the biblical writer, the gospel writer of Mark, makes an interesting comment. It's found only in Mark's gospel. Chapter 14, verse 51. "Now a certain young man was following Jesus, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They, the mob, caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked." Well, obviously we want to know, well, who was this young man and what was this all about? And one of the explanations is that this young man, who was a part of Jesus' disciple group, was the author of this book. He was a kinsman of Simon Peter. And so he wrote his autograph in the book. And by way of saying that I know these events to be true because I was there. But there's another way to understand this young man. Just as the blind man who needed a second touch was a metaphor for the disciples, just as Bartimaeus was a metaphor for the disciples, just as the deaf man was a metaphor for the disciples, So I would suggest to you that this young man is a metaphor for the disciples. They came wrapped in a linen cloth, linen reflecting affluence, status, and standing. The disciples came wrapped in their egocentric identities, comparing and competing, who was better than, who was less than. But in the arrest of Jesus, as they saw their hopes and dreams being shattered and crushed under the foot of a mob, they deserted Jesus. And in their desertion, their failure, they were stripped naked of their egocentric self. The pain of their desertion exposed the bankruptcy of their egocentric identity, the arrogance, the self-confidence that said, I'm better than, I will die for you if I need to. You see, pain is a part of the second touch. The egocentric identity has to be released before we can embrace the teachings of Jesus. The egocentric identity has an arrogance to it. The egocentric identity, this persona that we live, is a very fragile thing that we have to prop up with bravado, with self-effort and accomplishment. And nothing shatters the egocentric identity. Nothing shatters the veneer of that persona like failure. Failure and the pain of failure exposes the egocentric identity for what it is. A sham, a pretense that has no depth to it. That pain was a part of the second touch. Until the egocentric identity is released, we will struggle to live as the followers of Jesus, embracing the ways of the servant that he taught. Jesus actually spoke of this in chapter 9. In chapter 9, where he's talking about greatness, he talks about the radical self-discipline of plucking out an eye or cutting off a hand. That hyperbole, not to be taken literally, that says we are to deal radically with our egocentric identity. Otherwise, it will sabotage us. In that same context, Jesus also said, for everyone will be salted with fire. Fire is a cleansing agent. Salt in this context is the character of a disciple, a Christ-like character, the servant spirit. Jesus is saying that pain, that crisis, is a refining element that helps us release the egocentric identity so that the servant spirit can grow inside of us. Well, you might ask, well, is there any other way than pain for us to grow as disciples? Do we have to experience suffering? No, there is another way. And that is the way of the radical self-discipline. And Jesus teaches us what that radical self-discipline looks like. We go back to that Tuesday morning. The disciples are making their way again to the temple, and they go by the fig tree that is shriveled up to its roots. And they call attention to it. And Peter said, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. And Jesus answered and said, have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, now that mountain would have been the Mount of Olives, the mount that they went around from Bethany on their way, go across the Kidron up into Jerusalem. Truly, I say, if you say to this mountain, the Mount of Olives, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Well, how are we to understand this teaching? Obviously, the Mount of Olives is still there. The Sea of Galilee, the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, none of the three are full of mountains that have been cast into the sea. So obviously Jesus is speaking metaphorically, figuratively. What is the mountain that can be removed if we pray? Well, the next verse gives us a clue. Verse 24 again. Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you have received it, it will be yours. So whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. Here we catch a glimpse of the kind of mountain Jesus spoke of. It is the mountain that is in our heart. Here is the mountain is called the struggle to forgive. The unwillingness to forgive someone who has wronged me. By the way, the unwillingness to forgive is an expression of the egocentric identity. It is living as though I've been wronged and the other is in the wrong, and that makes me better than them and them less than them. It's merit-based thinking, because I will not forgive them unless they apologize to me. But you see, even the struggle to forgive is not a solitary mountain. The solitary mountain is accompanied by another mountain. Harbored hurt. We hold on to our hurt as a victim because it shows that we were the one who were wronged. The other was in the wrong, and so we're better than them. And the harbored hurt is accompanied by another mountain in that range, which is anger. Anger that is fermented and become bitterness and resentment. And that bitterness and resentment is accompanied by yet another mountain in the range, which is the desire for revenge. We want them to hurt the way we've been hurt. We want them to get what they have coming to you. So the struggle to forgive is actually just the front mountain on a range of mountains that dwell in our heart. And here's the thing. We're powerless to get rid of those mountains. You see, removing the mountain is not something we do. Moving mountains is the work of God. It is the work of the Spirit. But if we are willing to deal radically with what is within our heart, then the Spirit will move the mountains and cleanse the heart so that the servant spirit can grow within. So what does the faith look like that will move the mountains? It is the faith that is willing to pray about the mountain. Did you hear what Jesus says? Hear it again. Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. The faith that it takes to move a mountain is the faith that is willing to pray about the mountain. But here's the thing. As I deal with those mountains I've named in my own heart, I find that I don't want to turn loose of them. I want to hold on to my hurt and my resentment and my bitterness. I don't want to forgive. And while I don't want to turn loose of those things, while I don't want to forgive, there is something inside of me that wants to want to. So perhaps all the faith it takes to move those mountains from my heart is to have the courage to pray, Father, I don't want to forgive, but I want to. Praying such a prayer signs the permission slip for the Spirit of God to do the heart surgery that takes those mountains in my heart and casts them into the depths of the sea. The journey of discipleship is a journey that involves moving from one way of thinking to a new way of thinking, from one way of living to a new way of living. And a part of that journey is living in dependency upon the Spirit of God to teach us the things of God that Jesus taught, to cleanse what is in our hearts, so that we move beyond the self-serving spirit of the egocentric identity to the servant spirit of Christ that is willing to use power to address the needs of others. Well, as we come to the end of this session, as we come to the end of this series, take a few moments to reflect. If you're part of a study group, talk among yourselves. What stood out to you? What is your takeaway? What is it that you need to pray about? Thank you for being a part of this study. I pray for you on the journey that is ahead. For we have studied about the discipleship journey, the journey of those first disciples. And that journey of discipleship is your journey and my journey. I pray that you will know the peace of Christ, that you will know the work of the Spirit in that journey. I would welcome communication with you, feedback from you. You can reach me at Pastor Steve Langford, DMIN@gmail.com. I'll look forward to hearing from you. Until then, the peace of Christ be with you.